Hello, Spartans, back for another episode of History During a Pandemic. And this time, this week, we're going to get into U.S. imperialism and the positive and negative effects that it had, including things like the Spanish-American War and the Panama Canal. So the idea of imperialism is when one country, doesn't necessarily have to be a bigger country, but it is definitely a more dominating country, a stronger country, takes over or controls a smaller, weaker country. And it's for any number of reasons. A country can become imperialistic for economic reasons, military reasons, social reasons, and even political reasons. Most of the time, they all, almost always stem back to some kind of economic issue. Whether that country has some kind of natural resource, oil, gold, iron, whatever the case may be, maybe some kind of port. Think Hawaii. Before we made Hawaii into a state, we used Pearl Harbor as a military base, as a naval base. Most of the European countries were imperialistic. As you can see from the map here, that if you look at the color codes, that they were expanded out mainly into places like Africa. Most of Africa was taken over, and a decent amount of Asia. And what was happening here is the U.S. was starting to feel like it was being left out. And if it didn't get on the ball and become a little imperialistic itself, it was going to fall too far behind the European powers. So again, some of the reasons why imperialism occurs. Number one on the list is almost always going to be economics. European nations and eventually the United States would need natural resources to make the goods that go out to market that they sell. Especially a place like Great Britain, it's just an island. They're not going to have the natural resources that they need to make the things that they're making. So they have to go to other countries. Think about, the textiles of Great Britain. They needed U.S. cotton during until the Civil War hit. Then they went to places like India because they don't have the kind of land to be able to make the cotton themselves. Another thing was nationalism. This was kind of a big thing during this time. As countries came about, the United States was very nationalistic. Obviously, we were very patriotic after the American Revolution and became our own country. But even Italy and Germany unified in the late 1800s and came up very strong, very imperial, very nationalistic, I should say. Loved being German, loved being Italian. And a way to prove that was to go out and take over others and build up your country, even if it's at the expense of another country. Building up your military. Again, sometimes you need bases. Sometimes you can recruit people from other lands to join your army. The British were very good at this. And in some cases, there was a humanitarian edge to it. Political factors, doctors even, sometimes missionaries. And oftentimes the doctors and the missionaries went hand in hand. If you went to a place like Africa, a mission would be built to teach Christianity. But the way that you got people to join, besides just reading the Bible to them and praying with them, was to offer them assistance, to offer them medicines that they had never seen before, to offer them tools that they had never seen before. The U.S. had started to annex a number of territories, so they weren't necessarily new to this. In building their country, some of the territories that got annexed throughout its history were places like Texas, California, under some sketchy circumstances with the Mexican-American War. Florida was another example. We kind of pushed the Spanish into giving us Florida, but for a decent reason. Alaska was purchased. William H. Seward was Secretary of State, and he purchased Alaska for not much money. I think it was like 2 cents an acre by the time he was done. People criticized him for it. You can see this line here. It says he was criticized for buying Alaska because it was a walrus-covered iceberg. But by the time we were done, Alaska had some gold, but a lot of oil that still supplies us today. And it was definitely worth the money that we spent on it. We also started to show our influence in places like Japan. So we show up in Tokyo Bay with a brand new navy, trying to coerce Japan into trading with us. It wasn't like we were being nice about it. We went in with the Navy, we sailed in and said, hey, do you want to trade with us? And the idea was, show them we can do this by a friendly nature, or we can do this the hard way, and we can just come over and take you over, and we'll get the trade anyway. We also made a series of deals to expand trade in China. Japan and China were both very hard to trade with. They were a very homogenous community. They didn't want foreigners in their lands. So in a lot of ways, both China and Japan had to be kind of forced into it. And when you're the United States and Great Britain and you have a fantastic Navy, you can do those kinds of things. We also kept our eyes on the Caribbean and Latin America, which we'll get into later. We used two main forms of influence. U.S. businesses invested heavily in Latin American countries, which gave them a lot of political influence in those countries. They're called banana republics. So as an example, the Dole family. You may know Dole for canned fruit, especially pineapple. Well, they were the ones that owned pineapple plantations in Hawaii. Exceptional amounts of money. And when you have the money, you have control. And even though that's not your land and not your country, you can have a lot of political influence with the money that you bring in there, a lot of power. The U.S. also, and this may be the biggest one, the U.S. also scrapped its old wooden naval fleet and created a new steel, steam-powered ship. The whole Navy was like this now. And again, steel. We talked about Andrew Carnegie and the steel empire. Steel changed a lot of things during this time. And if you had a brand new steel Navy, you were in much, much better shape than some of the older navies, which we're going to see in the Spanish-American War. Steel versus wooden boat, there's just no contest. So the U.S. started to throw its weight around a little bit. And you'll see up here in the notes, you can read through this yourself, but they started to show a little bit in places like Chile and Brazil. They even forced the British into some kind of arbitration with Venezuela, according to the Monroe Doctrine. But the biggest one was Cuba. This is where we were going to see a big issue pop up. And you're going to find that some of this was justified, but a lot of this was brought about because of what we call yellow journalism. The newspapers wanted headlines, and they were going to make this worse, that they were going to escalate this. And this war probably could have been avoided if necessary, but we'll give you some of the background, and you can choose for yourself. So Cuba being an island off the coast of Florida, it's only about 90 miles off the coast. You can see this is Key West over here. You can see the southern part of Florida right here. This is Cuba. Okay, so it's not far at all. And it was owned by Spain. It was a Spanish colony for many, many years. But in 1868, the Cuban citizens started to rebel. And by 1895, that rebellion was really starting to heat up, that people were really starting to fight back, and the Spanish were having a hard time. So because of this, the Spanish doubled down. They sent 150,000 troops, and they set up what they call reconcentration camps to keep citizens from helping the rebels. The rebels would be up in the hills. They would be hidden, like guerrilla fighters. And what they would do is they would take any of the other citizens, especially family members, and put them into these reconcentration camps with the idea that maybe they could convince the rebels to give up when they see their family starving, dying from disease. And they did die. After 2 years, you can see right here, after 2 years, disease and starvation killed about 200,000 Cubans. So this was no joke. The Spanish meant business. The Cuban refugees in the United States, some of these people who had left Cuba and went to the United States to be protected, were begging Presidents Cleveland and McKinley to help. But both presidents refused, and probably for good reason. They didn't want to spend the money. They didn't want to take on the responsibility of a fight that was not theirs. This was between Spain and Cuba. And Spain had a right to be there because the Monroe Doctrine only applied to European nations if they weren't already colonized in that area. So the Cuban guerrillas escalated it. They wanted the United States to get involved, and they knew that the best way to hit us was economically. So Cuban guerrillas responded by burning U.S. property in Cuba, a lot of the sugar plantations that were down there. Lots and lots of money, millions of dollars being burned to the ground. It was going to hurt our economy. It will definitely get our attention. One of the biggest factors, and this is what I was talking about before, one of the biggest factors in the U.S. getting involved was yellow journalism. The yellow journalism were exaggerated news stories, not necessarily lies, maybe pretty close, towing that line, but they were definitely exaggerated so that the newspapers would sell. The New York World, that was run by Joseph Pulitzer, and the Pulitzer Prize in journalism is named after him, and the New York Morning Journal, run by William Randolph Hearst, the movie Citizen Kane is based on his life, often used yellow journalism to sell more newspapers. They were in conflict with each other, they were in competition, and they wanted to outsell each other. These yellow journalistic stories would rile up American citizens, causing what we call jingoist bursts of national pride. Jingoism is like, and this was something that happened after 9/11 for a small period of time. When we got attacked, the people in the United States, it didn't matter who was Democrat, Republican, whatever. Everybody felt American. Everybody felt protective of our country. We all felt this intense burst of national pride for a while. Everybody had flags flying outside their home for the first time. By 1898, riots had erupted in Havana, which is the capital of Cuba. Now, what you probably don't know about this is that before 1898, Havana was almost like a Las Vegas. It was a place where wealthy Americans went to party. Many casinos, a lot of dancing, rum making, a lot of drinking. And it was just a place for people to go and have a really, really good time. So when the rebels started to fight back, it became a little more dangerous. And President McKinley knew that American citizens are down there, that Americans own property down there. And just kind of like sending a police car down to honey farms to make sure the kids aren't, acting out, President McKinley sent the USS Maine down to Havana Harbor to protect Americans and their property. Just a show of force. Like, don't step out of line or the United States will do something. A few weeks later, though, a letter that had been stolen from the Spanish ambassador, and you can see that this is him right here, his last name is Delhomme. He wrote a letter, I'm not necessarily sure to who, but it was supposed to be private in nature, and he expressed his feelings about President McKinley as being weak and just an attention seeker. The problem was that somehow this letter got stolen and it got published for everybody to see. And when people started to read this, they didn't just see this as Delhomme insulting McKinley privately. They felt that Spain was insulting the United States publicly. And that was a little too much for some people to bear. And we got closer to war because of this. Soon after, and this may not have been the straw that broke the camel's back, but it was close. Soon after this, the USS Maine, which was sitting in Havana Harbor, exploded. Killed over 250 American sailors. Now, you and I both know that most likely what we would do is blame the Spanish. The Spanish didn't want us there. The boat is sitting there. They would love to show the United States that they mean business. Why not bomb it? Why not, use some kind of terrorist tactic and take it out? The cause most likely was an accidental fire in the ammunition storage. I had read reports about that they had barrels of black powder that was right next to the engine room. Well, the engine room can be very dry and it can cause a lot of static. And if any of that static charged up too much right next to the black powder, right next to the gunpowder, the whole thing could just go up. And they're pretty sure that this is what happened. Some people even thought that maybe the Cubans had done it because they were trying to instigate us into the war, but most likely this was just an accidental fire that blew up the ship. But, the newspapers were going to take off with this. They used the yellow journalism again. You can see in the picture here, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. It was pretty clear that they wanted an enemy to fight. So what's going to make this a little more complicated is the idea that if we were to get into a war with Spain, this doesn't necessarily have to be just about Cuba. Anything that Spain owns is open game. So we started to eye places around the world that the Spanish were owning, places in the Philippines as an example. At the time, Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary to the Navy, and he knew the Philippines would be an excellent base for the brand new steel Navy that we had, and it would help with trade. So if we were going to be shipping between India and China and places in Asia and the United States, it'd be great to have bases there. So we kind of eyed that. A war with Spain would give the United States the opportunity to take those over if we wanted to. So Roosevelt, with authorization, gave orders to the naval commanders to prepare to take the Philippines if war with Spain broke out. So they were ready for this. Spain did have one last chance to avoid war. And to be honest, McKinley did not want a war with Spain. He was trying to avoid this at all costs. He had been a Civil War guy. He knew what war meant. It was nothing to get into frivolously. So they did give him one more chance to get out of this. And the U.S. sent a number of conditions: that there would be compensation for the USS Maine blowing up, because we blame the Spanish for it; that the Spanish would have to end the reconcentration camps that they were using on Cuban people; that there would be a truce in Cuba, that there wouldn't be any more fighting and the killing would stop; and that Spain would give Cuba its independence. Spain agreed to all except to the last one. They just weren't going to give Cuba its independence because it would start kind of a domino effect. If Cuba got its independence, then what would stop any of its other colonies, including the Philippines, from fighting back and trying to get its independence? It would just start a bad precedent. So Spain agreed to everything except the last one. So President McKinley went to Congress and asked for war. And to be honest, probably one of the main reasons he did was public sentiment. The newspapers whipped up a frenzy in the United States population. People were calling for it. People wanted this war. There were any number of lies being told by the papers about how Spanish soldiers were treating American women, how they're being raped and mutilated and all these other things. So people were all whipped up about this, and they wanted a war, and so they got it. So right away, again, this wasn't necessarily just about Cuba. The first fighting that we saw was in the Philippines, where Admiral Dewey quickly launched an attack at Manila, which is in the Philippines, and destroyed the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet in 7 hours. And I don't know if you can see in the picture here or not, but you have the Steel Navy of the United States shooting down these wooden boats by the Spanish. It was just a turkey shoot. It was ridiculous. It was just a massacre. Probably should never have happened. And the Spanish probably should have known better and have just surrendered to begin with. The same thing's going to happen in Cuba eventually. The U.S. Navy also kept the Spanish Atlantic Fleet from leaving Santiago, Cuba. So Santiago is down here in the southern part of the island. And when they got stuck in that harbor, the United States fleet had just surrounded them and just destroyed the entire Navy. It got so bad that one of the admirals of the U.S. Navy told his men to stop cheering because so many of the Spanish were dying on these burning boats, and it just wasn't even a fair fight. Teddy Roosevelt quit his job with the Navy. He was kind of bored with it, and he wanted to get into the battle. He was one of those guys that just wanted to get involved in everything, and his life showed that he does a lot of these things. So he quit the Navy, and he joined a volunteer group known as the Rough Riders. And it was a group that he put together, a strange collaboration of different kinds of people who were just come from different tough backgrounds. And it included cowboys, miners, criminals, and college students. And they banded together, and they wound up going to Cuba, and they're famously known for charging up San Juan Hill and taking the hill from the Spanish. If you ever go to Teddy Roosevelt's place in Oyster Bay, New York, they have a little mini museum there outside of the house, and you can see his Rough Rider uniform that he wore. By December of 1898, the war is going to come to an end because it wasn't really even a war. This is a very one-sided event. The United States knew it was going to win. The Spanish should have known that we were going to win. They could have avoided a lot of loss, a lot of death, but they didn't. So after a month or two of this, the Spanish finally gave in, and they signed the Treaty of Paris. Cuba got its independence, like we had said. The U.S. would give Spain $20 million, which is something that we tend to do. It kind of takes a little of the edge off of the one-sidedness of this. And the U.S. would get the Philippines, which we had always wanted. We'd get Puerto Rico, which isn't far from Cuba. You can see it over here. Here's Cuba, there's Puerto Rico. But way, way over here on the other side of the world, the Philippines, and we also got the little island of Guam. Of these, we still have Puerto Rico. It's not a state yet, but there's been a push for it. And we still own Guam. The Philippines would get its independence from us after World War II. Now, the Philippines were not happy about this. They hated that the Spanish owned them, and they didn't like it any better that the United States now owned them. So instead of fighting against the Spanish now, which they were doing with US help, now they're going to turn and they're going to fight against us, and that's going to become an issue. The Filipinos resisted us being there, and a 3-year war broke out between the US and the Philippines that was led by Emilio Aguinaldo. And again, wars mean death. And so 4,000 Americans were killed in this. American soldiers would kill 16,000 Filipino soldiers and as many as 200,000 civilians. These losses are very hard to justify when you think about the reason why we were there to begin with was to take their land and their resources. And there's a good side, and this is where we have to kind of get into a little bit. It's called the white man's burden. This is something that European countries and the United States felt in taking over or controlling other lands. That when they go there, they bring education, they bring medicine, they bring technology, they bring a better way of life. And it's the white man's burden to go into these other lands where these other colored people are and to teach them a better way. We just didn't have much of an open mind towards other cultures at this time. So fighting would occur for years. The Philippines would not get its independence until 1946 after World War II. When we first declared war on Spain, one of the things that we agreed to was to not colonize Cuba. We wanted the world to think or to know that we were not getting into the Spanish-American War so that we could take over a place that we had always wanted. And we had always wanted it for a long, long time. And we were in there. U.S. businesses own sugar plantations there, but the Teller Amendment made it clear to the world that we would not get involved. But after the war, things are going to change. We put the U.S. military into Cuba so that we could protect our interests. But we also, like I was saying before, we established schools, we stabilized the economy, we set up a system led by Major Walter Reed of the Army Medical Corps that would eradicate yellow fever. He found a way to exterminate mosquitoes so that yellow fever would not spread among the population. So, even with the sketchy way of us being there, there were a lot of good things that did happen in Cuba because of us being there. But Cuba still felt betrayed, and you can understand why. What we did then was we offered the Platt Amendment. It kind of goes against the Teller Amendment in a lot of ways, but it was something to make them hopefully feel a little bit better, but in essence, it still gave us control. What would happen with the Platt Amendment is that Cuba agreed to not enter foreign agreements without U.S. approval. So Cuba is not independent at this point. If they wanted to get into some kind of agreement with Germany, Russia, any other country at all, they would have to get our approval first, like we were the parent giving approval to a child to do something. I don't think the Cubans appreciated that much. The U.S. also got to set up naval bases in Cuba. And strangely enough, this is something that happens when the United States gets into wars. We don't leave. So even today, as much as we don't get along with Cuba, we still own Guantanamo Bay. It's a naval base at the southern tip of Cuba that we still own to this day, which is crazy to think. Every time we get into a war, we stay where the enemy was. We are still in Germany and Japan after World War II, same kind of thing. Cuba reluctantly agreed, and this would stay in place until 1934, and we still own Guantanamo Bay today. Now, as far as Puerto Rico is concerned, it's a little more complicated. The U.S. military stayed in charge until 1900, and then the Foraker Act was passed, which would remove military control and set up a civil government under U.S. control. There would be some freedom, and control was handed to the Puerto Rican people. So they're kind of a mix of being citizens and not citizens. They're kind of in an in-between phase. In 1917, when the independence movements was growing, the U.S. passed the Jones Act. This granted Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship by congressional law, but not by the Constitution, which actually makes some changes. Then you get into Hawaii. By 1887, the U.S. involvement in Hawaii included Hawaii could trade sugar with us duty-free, meaning there was no taxes. Hawaii would lease Pearl Harbor to us as a supply and refueling station. And the white Hawaiian-born plantation owners would force the Hawaiian king, I'm never going to get this name right, but I think it's Kalakua, to sign control of the government over to them. When the king died, his sister Liliuokalani became queen. And she didn't look at the U.S. the same way that her brother did. She wanted the U.S. to have reduced power. She didn't want the plantation owners to have the same power that they had before. She thought she should be in charge. The Hawaiian people should be in charge of their own land, and the plantation owners should have a reduced power. By 1893, pineapple planter Sanford Dole used his political power to get the U.S. Marines to make Hawaii a republic. So they literally sent in the Marines because a business owner asked him to. They removed Liliuokalani from power, and by 1898, the U.S. had annexed Hawaii. So not our best moment, to say the least. And obviously we still own it. Hawaii would become a state in 1969, one of the last ones. They and Alaska were the last states to be made into states. In 1899, U.S. and Germany divided Samoa. The U.S. still owns it today, including the port of Pago Pago. And we also got into something called the open door policy in China. China had been carved up like a turkey by Europe. The opium wars with Great Britain were a big deal. And China was just weakened a lot because they didn't have the technology. They didn't have the same kind of guns. They didn't have the Navy. They didn't have a lot of stuff that the Europeans had. And now the United States was late to the game. They wanted to get in on this. So they pushed for this open door policy where the U.S. would pressure them to let U.S. companies trade goods in Chinese markets that had already been taken over by the Europeans. So none of this is good, obviously. None of this looks good on us as far as fair play, how we treat others in other lands and so on. But again, it's just the way of the world. Those that dominate run things. Whether it's right or wrong, it tends to be the way things are. Eventually, what you'll see when World War II comes around is there will be more of an equalizer. When nuclear power comes into play, you'll see that a lot of these wars are going to go away because nobody wants to start a nuclear war. Everybody present day wants the nuclear bomb. That's why you see places like Pakistan and North Korea and Iran are looking to get their hands on an atomic bomb so that they can have control, that they can be in the card game like the United States, the British, the Russians, and the Chinese. So again, it's the way of the world. This is what imperialism is. And we go to the next part. We'll get into the Panama Canal and a little bit more about Teddy Roosevelt as president. So I'll see you for the second part of the video soon, and thanks for listening.